Well, at Stratfor, we take a geopolitical view of China. And so everything from politics to economics to security issues, we filter that through this geopolitical model. So right now, the most important thing that we're looking at is the 2012 transition. And this actually has implications for all three, for politics, economics, and security. On a political front, we are seeing a lot of tension on the question of reform. And we've seen this being played out most recently with the issue of Bo Xilai, who recently was taken from power. He was the party secretary in Chongqing and now has been dismissed of his role in Chongqing as well as on the Central Committee. This is important because not only is it a political issue where we can see the various basically palace intrigue and infighting, but it's an economic issue as well, because the big question is reform. Bo had something that was called a Chongqing model, which was very heavily centered on state investment, state-owned enterprises. The reformers in Beijing are really much more interested in privatizing SOEs. And then where this goes into a security issue is the SOEs have a lot of vested interests in China. And there's a question on development. And when we see economics in decline, we've seen a rise in riots and protests throughout China. We've also seen a rise in holding foreigners for ransom as a result as well. So this is not only a domestic issue, it also does touch on international relations. So what we've been seeing lately, particularly since the economic crisis, we've seen these rise in the protests and we've seen rise in security incidents. What we've been seeing down south lately is a rise in kidnappings, or really more holding for ransom of foreigners. And this is a result of the economic crunch. And when we talk about economics and we talk about reform, there's a large contingent of the Chinese who want privatization. But we've got this vested state-owned enterprise interests. And then the question becomes, which better serves the people? And really there isn't an answer right now. If they go to privatization, then the economy will slow down. And then they're going to see the rise of public disgruntlement. And this is a huge issue for the Chinese Communist Party because a lot of what has their legitimacy is based on economic strength. But if they don't make these changes, if they maintain this state-centralized economy, then the problems that have led to this economic imbalance will continue. They're not really speaking of capitalism per se. They are a market economy, as many people would say, but they're really not a capitalist economy. Many people would argue that they actually do have to turn to capitalism. This is why we've seen the real estate bubble in China. It's because there are very few outlets. They do not have, a capital account, and it's not free, and there's no place for people to invest. So we've seen, as a result, the real estate bubble, because that is the one place that people can invest. We've also seen the Chinese trying to move their money out of China because there really isn't anywhere for them to put their money. So capitalism, I don't know, necessarily if that's the direction that they're heading. In some way that they are discussing that. The biggest thing when we talk about reform that's on the table for them right now is privatization. And this is a huge issue. So going beyond Bo Xilai and the issues that we've been seeing right now and the kind of inter-party struggles, it is an economic issue and it's a question of reform. And they're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And so they're trying to move slowly to try to address the situation in a Chinese manner, but external events really have prompted them to address it quicker than they were hoping or expecting to. It's also a year of transition. So we really see that they're trying to do everything that they can to maintain some sort of economic, political, and stability overall throughout the country through this transition. But I think after the transition happens, in 2013 to 2015 are going to be some of the most difficult years for China on all three fronts: economic, political, and insecurity related issues. The industry we see this most in is in manufacturing. So despite the economic slowdown, the people are still continuing to flock into the manufacturing industry in China, mainly because in the US there really is no capacity. China is one of the few countries that still has the capacity for the manufacturing industry. So we see that people flocking mainly to the south. That's where China's manufacturing and export industry is located. And where we see a lot of the problems aren't in the big cities like the Beijing and the Shanghai, but more of the small cities outside and more southern cities. And what happens is foreign manufacturer will come, try to set up a business. A lot of times there aren't any guarantees, there's no letters of credit, so the onus is on the foreigner. But if it's a big enough deal, if it's a multi-million-dollar deal, the Chinese will go ahead and accept the terms, payment in 90 days. This is great. Let's take the example of widgets. It's always the economic example of widgets. So they order 1 million widgets. Once the widgets are shipped, they find these widgets are completely defective. We're not paying. So the Chinese don't get their money. The next time the foreigners happen to be in that town trying to broker a new deal with a new widget factory, they're alerted, and they will be either held in their office for ransom, or there are times in smaller communities outside of some of the bigger cities where actually the whole community is in on this, including the police, where they're actually held at their hotel. So you go to a hotel, give your passport, the passport's held, the police say you're not going anywhere until we get our money.
Is this being openly reported?
This is something that it's interesting because it's in small communities with not a lot of media, and so it has not been the big cases we've heard about, but we've heard and noticed an uptick in this in the past few years, and no, it's not discussed very openly. Corruption is just endemic in the Chinese society, and a lot of it comes from this idea of guanxi, which loosely translates to relationships. So a lot of business deals are based on this guanxi, on this relationship. A lot of times people get into these relationships in China, both the Chinese themselves and with the foreigners, where trust is built on this and not built on contracts. And to add to this, there's also, what makes things difficult in China is state-owned enterprises are state-owned. And so this goes to the issue of national secrets. So anytime you're dealing with a large state-owned enterprise, you have to be very careful, because if you are sharing national secrets, or if they are sharing national secrets with you, you could further find yourself in trouble with the Chinese, not just with your home country with bribery, but with the Chinese for dealing in national secrets. And national secrets changes based on the sensitivities of the day. So manufacturers looking to invest in the export market are still flocking into China. However, there has been a huge decrease in export numbers. So China has primarily based its growth on its export industry, and that is slowing. And so what it's done instead is to really boost up investment, and that's the model that cannot continue indefinitely. There's always been a problem with organized crime, and we've seen it increase not just since the economic crisis, although even more so then, where people do use thugs to get business deals done. But that's been even prior to the economic crisis. Do we see an uptick in it? Yes, in the case of ransom, like I mentioned before. We've seen an uptick also in Macau of money laundering. And so as an Australian, I'm sure that you're aware, when you've got casinos, global casinos that have an operation in, say, in Queensland, Gold Coast, and you've got a similar operation in Macau, that's one way that they can transfer money without it kind of being monitored. So the gambling proceedings that you pick up in a casino in Macau, you can go pick up in Australia. So we've seen an uptick in that as well. It's very difficult to do. Like you said, there will be legitimate companies that are producing Louis Vuitton bags, and at night that exact same company is producing extra for either the domestic market or for other customers. So what happens is there are several security agencies that are able to help in this regard, but a lot of times the local police are in cahoots with these manufacturers. And so you shut one down and it just pops back up in another place. And given the economic difficulties going on right now, whereas at one point prior to the crisis, the Chinese government sincerely said that they were going to deal with this, at some point now, employment of people is still extremely important. And where the counterfeit market serves that interest economically, then they tend to look the other way. So when we see employment numbers go down and companies in crisis, then the issue of addressing IP interest is not considered as important anymore. So we definitely see this being a continual problem. China is still relatively safe. Again, as I mentioned, the manufacturers have a bit more of a harder time of it, particularly in the export market. But there's always a risk right now, particularly not just because of the global economic crisis, but there really, given the transition, there really isn't the time or the focus of the central government to address these security issues as they pertain to foreigners. So right now everything's a little bit willy-nilly as everyone tries to keep the peace moving into this transition. So you've got people acting out of desperation more than they did before. Although the central government is serious about trying to create a stable environment, they've got their own crises that they're trying to deal with. You add the military into the mix, they've got their own agenda. So right now it's an issue where there are countries that are more risky to be operating in, for sure. But the environment in China is risky, and it seems to be getting riskier. The Chinese knew that the Australians weren't going to go through with this. So any response right now that seems as overreaction is truly that. It's an overreaction. They weren't expecting to get this bid. At the same time, they continue to pronounce the same as they've done over and over again with Huawei, is that we are an open, we are absolutely, everything is above board. But the fear there that's always been with Huawei is they do, even though they are a private company, they do have relationships with the state. And so any type of broadband system, there is the fear that if it were built by a Chinese company, that it could be compromised by state interests. So this was to be expected. Is it going to affect Australian relationships? Rhetorically, maybe. But I think China needs Australia as much as Australia needs China. So again, it was something that was to be expected, not something that they're happy about, but will it have long-lasting effect on Australian-Chinese relationships? Probably not.
Pleasure talking to you.
You too, thank you.